everybody. There's going to be a lot of people signed in on this program. If you are having issues with hearing the presenters, if you look up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, there is a box you can click, which will give you a translation of the spoken word. You might have to minimize that box so it's not blocking your whole screen. If you have a question for the presenter, use the chat feature rather than, ask the question out loud. It's easier for us to answer questions that way, and we'll reserve our questions to the end. We are recording this presentation, and it will be available on the Woodstock Conservation Commission website within a few days. So if you missed it, or if you thought it was a great presentation and you want to share it with people, you'll be able to do that. We'll also be sharing links to other related information on the Conservation Commission website. And I will put the Conservation Commission website address in the chat so you can copy it. So this is to remind everybody that Woodstock, as our Conservation Commission, has a plan of open space and conservation, which we put together over 20 years ago. We have committed open spaces in town, and they're scattered all over different parts of town. And we know there's areas of open space in our neighbor towns. And we've always thought that instead of having islands of open space, we should have linkages for those pieces of open space to create wildlife corridors that would allow wildlife to migrate between these important areas. So we started a Greenways initiative, and we started bringing in people from, conservation experts to give us some guidance. And we ended up getting Little River in Woodstock and Putnam, an intermunicipal greenway, as a resource conservation strategy. And at the same time we were doing this, other towns were getting involved in these greenway initiatives as well. So we have the Natural River Watershed Greenway, which is a part of Woodstock as well. And then further west, we have the Mount Hope River and the Fenton River Greenways. So there's a region-wide focus on connecting our preserved areas. Pollinator pathways are a different kind of greenway. These are not protected lands. These are people's private properties. And if everybody be willing to plant native plants and trees on their land that will support our native pollinator species, it's like making a voluntary greenway for smaller organisms like bees and butterflies that we all see. So that's what a pollinator pathway is. It's connecting our preserved lands. So to talk more about native plants and our pollinator species, I've invited Emily May. She's a pollinator conservation specialist from the Xerces Society. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so she could put hers up, because I'm sure her pictures are a lot more outstanding than mine. So Emily, it's your turn.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Okay, let's see if I'll share mine. Can you see my slides?
I do now.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. My name's Emily May. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with the pesticide program at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. Thanks to the Woodstock Conservation Commission for organizing this event. So I'm excited to talk with you today about a little bit about sort of the importance of pollinators, and then exactly what Jean said, how we can build sort of our own little contribution to larger corridors, larger greenways into our own yards to build high quality connected habitat for pollinators. All right. If you haven't heard of the Xerces Society, we've been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates, or animals without a backbone, and their habitat. And our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. It was a butterfly that lived in the coastal sand dunes around San Francisco. And a little background on me, I have been working with Xerces since 2015. And for the last 5 years, I was living in Connecticut. So I may have interacted with some of you. And I just moved this year to Vermont, still in the same type of position with Xerces, but in a new place. Xerces is actually based on the West Coast, but we have staff across the country doing a variety of on-the-ground conservation work. We have programs in pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides, and then a new community engagement program that's focused more on urban communities. So with all of that, let's get started and dig in first for some just basic review of the importance of pollinators in our natural and crop ecosystems. I think if you've tuned in here tonight, you're already aware that pollinators are animals that move pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part in order for plants to set seeds and produce fruit, are really essential for our ecosystems and for our diets. They're incredibly important for natural systems and allow wildflowering plants to reproduce and keep reseeding in their environments. And the seeds and fruits that those flowering plants produce are also food sources for many other types of wildlife, from birds to mammals and us. Through the simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower, pollinators help build out the base of the food chain for many species and are also actually part of that base themselves. Caterpillars, or larval butterflies and moths, are an incredibly important protein source for many birds, especially birds feeding their young. About 9 in 10 bird species actually eat insects at some point in their lives. And pollinators are important for our diets. This photo is from a small project that we did with Whole Foods a few years ago. And this is what a typical produce section looks like in a grocery store with all the pollinated foods that we enjoy. And then this is what it might look like if we didn't have pollinators. So over half of the items in the produce section rely to some extent on pollinators. And without pollinators, it would be a sad place to shop. So what are the pollinators? Who are the pollinators responsible for this essential service? There's lots of different animals that visit flowers, usually for sugary nectar, and end up pollinating those plants, whether intentionally or by accident. And plants really require a diversity of pollinators for sustainable pollination. So we have butterflies, we have flies, beetles, wasps, and also vertebrate pollinators. So bats, some bats and some birds are also visiting flowers and moving pollen around. But our very important, our VIP pollinators are bees. And we have an amazing diversity of native bees in the US. There are over 350 species of bees just in Connecticut, and more than 10 times that number across the whole country. They range in size from big carpenter bees that get into your sheds to tiny bees like the size of a freckle. And a lot of them don't really look like what you might picture when you think of a bee, like that metallic green sweat bee with the yellow striping. You might not think of that, first off the top of your head when you're asked to picture a bee, but it's among the many bees out there that are going out and actively collecting pollen to feed their young, which is what makes bees such important pollinators. So they are, and unlike all the other things visiting flowers for nectar and sort of accidentally moving pollen, bees are actively transporting pollen from flower to flower. And they have all kinds of specialized body features for collecting that pollen, which makes them very efficient at it. So if you look at the bee on the top left, that's a small sweat bee that has pollen packed in under the top of her hind legs. And the bee underneath her on the bottom left is leafcutter bee, which is called a leafcutter bee because it cuts out little pieces of leaves and uses those to create walls within its nest with these little cutout leaves. So leafcutter bees and mason bees, they're related, all collect pollen on these specialized hairs on the bottom of their abdomen. You might be able to see it if you squint, looking at this bee on the bottom left. And so these bees are truly excellent pollinators of plants that have open flowers, like the flower in that picture, or apples, and other sorts of tree fruit, where they can just kind of belly flop onto the flower and bustle around, getting those special hairs that collect pollen nice and loaded up with dry pollen, and then moving that pollen from plant to plant. So they're really, really excellent pollinators. I did want to quickly talk about honeybees, which are probably the first bee that pops into your head when you're asked to think about a bee. The European honeybee is a pretty unique species. It was brought to America by ship with colonists, and it's a single species that among bees is kind of different than a lot of our native free-living bees here. So European honeybee is social. It has a caste system where there's a queen, and it sort of divides up the labor of the colony. So there's a queen and her offspring workers and drones. And those workers are contributing cooperatively to running the colony. The queen is producing multiple generations of offspring per year, and that colony lives for multiple years and overwinters by feeding on honey stores. So that's different than a lot of our native, solitary bees, which are annual. They just live for a single season for a couple weeks and then overwinter as a pupal stage usually, or in some kind of dormant stage, instead of living over the winter above ground like honeybees do. And because of all of these features, these colonies, which have thousands of bees in them, can be managed for crop pollination. So that's a relationship with humans that this species has had for many, many years. Most of the more than 3,600 species of native bees in the United States are quite different from honeybees. The vast majority of them live below ground, with only really small holes that give any sign that they're there below ground. Another 30% or so live above ground in tunnels, in old snags, or in pithy plant stems. So this is on the right, a Seratina bee, which is a small carpenter bee living in a blueberry cane. And then the bees that are actually probably the most similar to honeybees out of all of our native bees are bumblebees, which is on the left here, the big fluffy ones. They are also social like a honeybee. So they have a queen and then they have workers. And they form much smaller colonies than honeybees do, about 25 to a couple hundred workers, as opposed to maybe 10 or 20,000 bees like a honeybee. But they could live above or below ground. They kind of like to find old cavities, like rodent holes or holes in stumps and that kind of thing, where they can build out a small colony. So like I mentioned, a lot of our native bees live on the soil. Some of their nests above ground, really at the soil surface, can look a bit like ant nests, where they've kind of dug out the soil, excavated the soil from the nest, and there's a little bit of it sort of scattered around the entrance. And a lot of times those nests can be found in bare, exposed soil, in sandy to loamy soils. That's not always the case. There's plenty of bees that like to nest in heavy vegetation too, but they're oftentimes easier to see when they're present in bare soils. And those nests underground are pretty interesting. This is not a piece you usually see from the soil surface, but they might dig down anywhere from a couple of centimeters to a meter below ground, and have these elaborate tunnel systems where they've excavated the soil out, and then down at the bottom, they've created these cells where they're putting pollen and nectar into these balls and then lay their egg on top of them. And every cell is an individual little bee that they've laid. A lot of the bees that nest below ground line their nests with waxy secretions that help the egg and the developing larvae then resist moisture and be protected from some of the conditions of the soil that might threaten them otherwise. So just to give you a little picture of a life cycle, this is a mining bee, an andrina. So there's a lot of mining bees that are kind of early spring bees. They come out and they pollinate trees and shrubs and early spring plants, and then live a couple of weeks as adults for that spring season. So this is what a year in the life of a mining bee looks like. So the adult emerges in early spring. This is an adult female living a solitary lifestyle. She's going out collecting pollen and nectar, bringing it back to her soil nest, building this pollen ball, laying an egg on it. And then the egg develops underground, feeding on that pollen ball through the season, the summer season, and overwinters as a pupa before emerging as an adult the next spring. That's sort of what an annual solitary bee lifestyle looks like. Above ground solitary bees are much the same in terms of their lifestyle, but they have different nest structure. So these are bees that live in the hollowed out plant stems or lived in old beetle tunnels and wood. So leafcutter bees, mason bees, small carpenter bees are all bees that live above ground in these kinds of tunnels. And so this is a picture on the bottom right of a mason bee nest in, I think, some kind of reed or bamboo. And so what these bees do is they find a tunnel that works for them that's usually about the size of their abdomen. So if you're looking to provide nest shelter for above ground nesting bees, you might want to put in a range of sizes of holes, because bees like to have a hole that's right about the same size as their body, so that as they're going into the tunnel, if they're carrying pollen mites or something like that, it's going to kind of scrape off naturally as they enter this tunnel. They don't want something that's too big, and they obviously can't get into anything that's smaller than their body. So they're looking for something that's like the Goldilocks situation. It's just right. So this mason bee has found a tunnel that's just right for her. She has collected mud and made a partitioned wall at the back of the tunnel. And then she starts going out collecting pollen and nectar, building that pollen ball, just like a soil nesting bee would. And it can take a lot of flower visits to do just one of these pollen balls. It's a lot of energy that goes into the providing for her offspring. So something upwards of 1,000 flower visits for just one pollen ball for one egg. So she's done all of that work. She lays an egg on the pollen ball and then collects more mud and walls it off and starts the process again for her next egg. And so on and so forth until she fills up this tunnel. The cool thing about bees, one of the many cool things about bees, is that they're what's called haplodiploid, which means they have the ability to choose whether they're going to fertilize an egg or not, making it either a female if it's fertilized or a male if it's unfertilized. So typically with these types of tunnel nesting bees, you'll see the back of the tunnel, which is the most protected from predators, being female eggs, and then the front of the tunnel being the male eggs, the unfertilized eggs, which then are sort of protecting those females at the back from getting predated over the winter, but also are then able to sort of emerge first in the season and be ready for mating in the spring. So it's just kind of an interesting feature of how these bees end up laying their eggs in these tunnels. So one thing I get a lot of questions about are bee hotels. And I don't have the time to really get into all the details here, but I will say that they're definitely variable in quality. I don't know what would nest in that example on the left, but it's not the butterflies that are advertised as its residents. It's probably other things. I'm not sure what would nest in there, honestly. The concern, I think, with some bee hotels is that if they don't get cleaned out, or if there's a huge volume of bees nesting in there and they're sort of left from year to year, there's concerns, as you would with any kind of high volume scenario, with diseases and pathogens building up or attracting in predators that can then kind of wipe out everything that's living in a single bee hotel. So the things that I emphasize are trying to keep them sort of relatively small. If you're putting out bee hotels, small, clean, and spread out. So not concentrating a ton of bees in one location in a mega hotel. because we don't want to be creating a scenario where we're attracting in lots of bees to nesting resources and then allowing them to kind of die off because of a pathogen or because they became very tasty fodder for some birds that made their way to the hotel. So keep them small, clean, and spread out is my recommendation if you're going to have put out nesting resources for bees. So I'm going to just talk briefly about bumblebees because they are a little bit different than the solitary bees and the lifestyle that or the life cycle that I outlined before. So bumblebees are social, just like a honeybee, where they're founded by a single queen. This is a common eastern bumblebee on Dutchman's breeches, which is a great spring ephemeral nectar plant for these pollinators you might see in the woods. So bumblebee colonies, unlike honeybees, are annual. So the colonies only last for a single season, one summer. And their nests might contain anywhere from a couple dozen to a couple hundred workers. Right about this time of year, you're most likely just seeing queens out. So queens will overwinter. They get nice and plump in the fall and then find a place to overwinter as a mated queen and come out in the spring and establish their own nest. So just about this time of year, they're going out to trees and shrubs and early spring ephemerals. And at this time, they're really acting more like a solitary bee, where it's the queen doing all of the work of the nest. And then by the time that her first brood hatches in early summer, those will be smaller typically than the queen herself. Then those worker females will take over the tasks of the colony of going out to feed on flowers and bring back pollen and nectar. And the queen will just sort of remain in the nest at that point, laying eggs. The midsummer is typically the colony peak for bumblebees. And by the time that we reach kind of late summer, early fall, the queen is starting to produce males and new queens, so the new queens are big and fat like the original queen was. The worker bees, the female workers, are small. And then males tend to typically be somewhere in between in terms of size. So the males leave the nest, the new queens leave the nest, they mate, and then the new queens fatten up and seek overwintering sites in the fall, and the original queen dies. So that's sort of the life cycle of the bumblebee. So bumblebees are one of those bees that really needs resources, floral resources with nectar and pollen, all the way from early spring through the fall. So early spring, the queens are coming out. That's a really vulnerable time for them. They really need resources then. Summer is the reproductive peak of colonies. That's when you have tons of bees out looking for floral resources. And then the fall is also really critical because that's when queens are wanting to fatten up and get ready for winter. So like I mentioned, bumblebees like to seek out little cavities for their colonies. So these are some examples of places that bumblebees have nested. They often are seeking out abandoned mouse or rodent nests that have some old fur that they can use to kind of keep their colonies warm. The bumblebees like a lot of mess. They like going in at the base of bunch grasses that have like old vegetation that they can use to kind of paper their nests, or they like these rodent holes or compost piles. They like warmth and they like mess. So why do we need to talk about conservation of pollinators? We don't always have the monitoring data to say, this species is in decline or that species is in decline, but there is a good amount of evidence suggesting that overall we're seeing some declines in abundance of our pollinating species due to a lot of the same stress factors that threaten other kinds of wildlife. So some of the key risk factors fall into the same kind of major buckets as other wildlife. So loss of habitat, loss of food and shelter, flowering resources, pesticide use in both agricultural and urban spaces, and diseases and invasive or non-native species that compete with bees for resources, and then climate change. So changes to the timing of when plants flower changes, like erratic weather patterns that can mess with when plants are blooming, when there's, an early season warm up and then a freeze. There's lots of different ways that a changing climate might interfere with what pollinators need. And so that's something that we're learning more about all the time. It's a bit complicated and we can't always predict what the effects are going to be. But for all of these things, we can contribute to addressing those risks with a few different things that we can even put into place around our own homes. So there's steps we can take. For habitat loss, we can conserve and create habitat, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. I'm also going to talk a little bit about pesticides and how we can all work to reduce our general reliance on pesticides. For disease and non-natives, we can reduce the risks from managed and invasive species. And then for climate change, when we're planning out and creating new habitat, we can plan for species diversity in that habitat, which builds resilience to climate change into the system. So on creating habitat, here's the basic framework. These habitat requirements are the same in all different spaces, from urban centers to farms and ranches. So where we find opportunities for protecting, improving, and building new habitat might differ a bit between those. But in the end, all bees need are food, shelter, and refuge from pesticides. So food is nectar and pollen. Shelter is nesting spaces that are undisturbed, as well as overwintering sites for other beneficial insects. And then refuge from pesticides is relatively self-explanatory, but I will talk about it a little bit more. And could I ask if you have your microphone on, if you could just mute? I'm hearing some feedback from someone, I'm not sure. So let's talk a little bit about how you would choose plants.
Are you busy?
No.
Oh, good.
Not really.
Crystal, I don't know if you're able to mute participants. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about what you would do if you're planning habitat for pollinators. So what you want to do first off the bat is to provide flowers throughout the season. So like I mentioned, with bumblebees that are present throughout the growing season, they're going to need something at every point in the year. And then you have different species that are coming out for short periods of time throughout the season that need abundant resources for that short window of time when they're active. So there's things that bloom early in the season, so trees and shrubs, and then some herbaceous forbs like spiderwort. Then in early summer, you get even more diversity of herbaceous forbs, and late summer again too. There's lots of great choices for what you can put into the ground at any given time throughout the growing season. But the important thing is just to have a diversity and abundance of different plants that flower at any given time. So some examples from early spring are our trees and shrubs like willows, maples, serviceberry, and redbud. Those are really great early season forage for pollinators. And then if you have, woodlands, figuring out if you're able to cultivate some spring ephemerals. So things like this Dutchman's breeches are really wonderful spring plants for bumblebees and other bees that might be active in woodland floors. Going into the summer, you get a lot more variety and color. You can have partridge pea, bee balm, coreopsis, milkweeds, coneflowers, sunflowers. Depending on what your sort of site conditions are, what you're able to support, there's lots of great options for pollinator plants. And then going into the fall, we get lovely purples and yellows, goldenrods and asters, Joe Pye weed and ironweed, all great plants for supporting those very hungry bumblebees and other late season bees. One thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about how to structure your pollinator garden is to select species from as many different plant families as you can. So there's a few plant families that tend to be the sort of heavy hitters for attractive pollinator plants. So your asters are one, legumes and mints are all really important sort of attractive pollinator plants. But the more diversity that you can build in from other plant families, the more likely you are to attract a pollen specialist. So there's a subset of bees that really have specialized relationships with plants. And some bees are like bumblebees are real generalists, so they'll visit all kinds of different plants. And then you have bees, like there's a loosestrife bee that really just feeds on loosestrife pollen. So the more plant families you're building in to the mix, the more likely it is that you're going to end up supporting a specialist bee. If you want to learn more about pollen specialists, Jared Fowler has put together some guides to specialist bees and the plants that they forage on for the eastern and the central US. So jaredfowler.com is a place to look up some of those resources around if you're wanting to support, certain kinds of pollen specialist bees, what plants to put in the yard. Now, bees, of course, are not the only thing we're thinking about. If you're wanting to support butterflies and moths, you're going to want to include larval host plants. So the native milkweeds are, of course, the host plant for monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are undergoing severe declines across their range, some due to kind of the loss of overwintering habitat in Mexico, but also the loss of forage and loss of host plants across their breeding range in North America. Milkweeds are also a high quality nectar source for other pollinators and beneficial insects, from lady beetles to pirate bugs and surface flies. I can't talk about every single host plant for butterflies and moths, but if you're interested in cultivating plants for butterflies, we have a book on gardening for butterflies from Xerces. I would also direct you to wildflower.org, which is the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And they have great lists of host plants for different types of butterflies, and you can search by state. So that's a really nice resource for looking up host plants for different butterflies. When you're going out and purchasing plants, some things to keep in mind. Ornamental varieties can look pretty, but sometimes, a lot of times, don't have that much habitat value. So that's things like really showy varieties that are double petaled. So double petaled varieties have basically substituted extra petals in place of the anthers that supply pollen. So showy double petaled varieties have little to no pollen. Some of them, if you're looking at the flower and you can't see how they would access any kind of pollen or nectar, they probably can't. So some roses that are, very, very densely petaled, that nectar and pollen would be inaccessible to a bee, as opposed to like a wild rose that has an open flower structure where the pollen and nectar are readily accessible. Those are some things to keep in mind when you're thinking about, would a bee actually be able to get anything out of this plant? Take a look at, how close is it to sort of a wild species, and how accessible is that pollen and nectar? And then importantly, making sure that plants that you're purchasing from a nursery aren't pre-treated with insecticides. And we have some new resources, new materials for you to use in thinking about how you can find bee-safe plants. Or if you're working with a nursery and you want to help them towards more pollinator-friendly production, we also have a new guide for nurseries about pest management practices that are better for pollinators. It's pretty typical in typical sort of horticultural trade, the use of systemic insecticides for pest control is really common. So this is something to talk to your nursery about and make sure that the plants that you're putting in your yard to conserve pollinators are going to be free of the pesticides that might cause them harm. So xerces.org is where we have these resources, lots more information there about nursery production of plants and how you can talk to your nursery about bee-safe plants. So that was the food section. Then I'm going to talk for a couple slides here about nesting. So in terms of providing nesting and shelter for bees and other beneficial insects in your yard, the first thing that I want to just talk about is leaving the leaves, which is a really simple practice for providing overwintering habitat for lots of different beneficial insects. So a lot of insects overwinter in leaves and other decomposing plant material. So if you're going to, if you're wanting to conserve those insects over time, you want to avoid shredding leaves. And then, if you're able to, you can kind of rake them off and spread them around vegetables or flower beds, or pile them around as mulch around trees and shrubs and perennials. But leaving some leaves instead of bagging them all up and pulling them off can be good if you're wanting to provide overwintering habitat for beetles, butterflies, moths, and more. In terms of bee nests, a lot of the bees are living underground, so the main thing is just not tilling them up. But for the ones that are living above ground in stems, if you have plants with pithy or hollow stems, like caneberries, sumacs, joe pye, coneflowers, even bee balm. I've had small carpenter bees living in my bee balm stems. What you're going to want to do is leave flower stalks over the winter. And if you can leave them for all time, that's great. But if you're wanting to clean up the garden at a certain time of year, probably the best time to do that is in middle spring when temperatures are consistently over 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can cut those stems back at a variety of heights and then watch for activity from stem nesting bees that are coming to the new holes that you've created in those stems. So the longer you can leave the leaves, the longer you can leave flower stalks, the more those are providing sort of nesting and overwintering habitat. But there are ways you can kind of tweak the cleanup timing to be better for overwintering insects. So coming back to this basic framework of habitat needs, we've talked about food, now we've talked about shelter. And then the rest of this presentation is going to talk a little bit about how we can also provide refuge from pesticides. And when I say pesticides, I mean a whole range of chemicals, including insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. Insecticides are the ones that are meant to kill insects, and they generally pose the biggest risk to bees and other beneficial insects. But other pesticides can have harmful effects. And so in order to protect pollinators, it's important to think about the many ways that they might be exposed to pesticides, whether from you or from a neighbor. Various exposure pathways depend on the pesticide itself and how it's been applied, but they can include direct contact of a bee on a flower receiving a pesticide application. It's kind of the worst case scenario. Indirect contact, where a bee walks onto a flower or leaves that have been treated in the past and contact the residue. Lawn chemicals applied for grub control are a form of systemic insecticide. So systemic insecticides are water soluble and can be taken up by plants and expressed in pollen and nectar or in leaves, which could be a concern if you're a caterpillar munching on those leaves. So lawn chemicals applied for grub control are one way. Systemic insecticides might move into plants around the yard and get into pollinator plants. Other common pesticide applications around homes that you might not connect to pollinators but might be harmful include things like backyard treatments for mosquito and tick control, soil drenches around the foundation of homes for termites or carpenter ants. A lot of those are systemic as well and are meant to be quite persistent. So you can find them year after year around the foundation of a home, getting into plants that are planted around that foundation. Then soil drenches or trunk injections for tree pests that make their way into the pollen and nectar of those trees. So those are some that you might not necessarily connect to a pollinator, but could be a place where a pollinator would become exposed to a pesticide. And each of them kind of requires some thought in weighing costs and benefits, and then ways to reduce risk to a pollinator. The type of bee and its behavior, so whether it nests in the soil or above ground are key to thinking about possible exposure routes. So some native bees collect pieces of leaves for their nests, leafcutter bees. So if those leaf materials are contaminated, that's one exposure route. Other bees nest in the ground. So if the leaves or soil are also contaminated, and so if the soil is contaminated, excuse me, that might be a place where they were also being exposed. All things to sort of think about from a bee's perspective. So one thing I often mention in these talks is that just because something is organic doesn't mean it's risk-free for pollinators. There are some organic insecticides, certainly not as many as conventional insecticides, but some that are highly toxic on contact to pollinators. So pyrethrins and spinosad are two. And then there are others, you know, I often hear things like, oh, it's just neem oil. Well, some have other concerns. So neem oil would be an example of an insect growth regulator, which is something that is not toxic to adult insects typically, but might be toxic to larval insects, so caterpillars. Bt is something that it's a soil bacterium that produces these little proteins, crystal proteins that poke holes in insect stomachs, and different strains of Bt are specific to certain groups of insects. So there's a Bt that targets Lepidoptera, that's common in organic agriculture. So Lepidoptera is butterflies and moths. It's practically non-toxic to bees, but that Bt strain it has toxicity to butterflies and moths. So just to keep in mind that all pesticides probably have concern for some insect out there, and really good to know what you're applying and how it works and what you might be harming when you apply it. By steering you away from pesticide products, that's also not to say that you should necessarily concoct your own remedies. Just because an ingredient is familiar and non-toxic to you doesn't make it safe to pollinators, especially when put in mixtures. So something like dish soap is an example of something that I see recommended as a way to kill insects in gardens. It can have other impacts on your plants. So dish soap is not formulated for use on plants. And so it can strip away the natural oils and waxes on plant surfaces and eventually stress them out from other reasons. These really aren't meant to be used in your home garden. I also have found some interesting things when I search around on gardening forums. This was an example of someone who used foot fungus cream to create her own fungicide. Please don't do that either. Different fungal diseases have different things that would target them. Foot fungus cream is meant for the type of fungus that's found on your foot and not the type of fungus that attacks a plant. So just keep in mind that these things were not formulated for use in your garden and can have unintended consequences, especially when they're applied at really high doses. So the important thing is when you're building a garden, when you're trying to make it as resilient as possible for pollinators and against pests, it's all about finding the right plants for the right place, building healthy soils, getting as much plant diversity as possible. All of these things will help your plants be less stressed out and more resistant to pests. Don't crowd plants, give them enough sunlight, give them enough airspace so that they have the best chance to succeed without your additional interventions. That's the same for your garden as well in terms of managing pests while protecting pollinators. The best step you can take is to do a little preventive management. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So choosing and planting resistant varieties, whether that's your tomatoes or your squash, rotating your gardening vegetables, making sure you're staying on top of soil fertility and pH, keeping your plants as happy as possible, and then watering wisely. A lot of times I see, those big oscillating waterers. And I would say that actually the best way to water is a soaker hose or drip irrigation. When you have the overhead sprinklers that go back and forth, they tend to just water that top inch of soil or two and promote kind of shallow root growth. What you want to promote is that deep root growth so that your plants can better withstand heat and drought stress later on in the season. So soaker hose or drip irrigation will go a long way to promoting plants creating roots that go further down into the soil. So you've planted appropriate species, you've planted appropriate varieties, you're building healthy soils, you're watering wisely. The next step deeper on active prevention is physical barriers and mulches. So using barriers and mulches to exclude insect pests, to exclude weeds. Many of you may compost yard waste and other materials, which you then put back into your garden beds. So if you're composting, you do want to make sure that that compost is reaching high enough temperatures to actually kill off the pathogens from any plant materials that you're putting in there. And that usually can't be accomplished without some active management to make sure that you're sort of turning and recharging your compost pile with fresh carbon and nitrogen and water and air to let it actually reach those high temperatures that it needs to. Other preventive steps include pruning trees and shrubs in the spring to improve airflow in those. A lot of times plants are very happy after they've been pruned. And then using trap crops to attract and manage insects that might otherwise become pests on various crops. So just a couple of quick slides here on sort of the decision-making process around knowing what kind of things are infesting your garden and then how to make decisions about them. So if you're seeing insects and plant damage and other symptoms, sometimes sometimes the obvious symptom is damage, sometimes the obvious symptom is insects. So what I want you to do is look really closely and take some good photos and notes about the symptoms and the timing and the type of damage. A smartphone can be a really useful gardening tool to help an expert identify your problem for you. To manage those things, you really need to know what you're dealing with before you can make any decisions. Get a firm ID. Just because something is eating your plants doesn't mean it's harmful. If you have caterpillars munching on your milkweeds, that's great. That's probably why you put your milkweeds in your garden. This was a plant, this is my echinacea in Connecticut, and there was a lot of dark webbing and frass that was embedded between the little bracts, the orange bracts on the flower heads. So I couldn't actually tell what was going on in it, but I pulled a couple of the flower heads apart and found this striped caterpillar at work, which I then had to figure out what the heck it was because I hadn't seen it before. And there's lots of tools online that can help you with that kind of thing. Not everybody knows an entomologist, but there are lots of resources to help with identifying insects or plant diseases. So a quick internet search with a good description can be a good start. But Cooperative Extension, UConn, the Master Gardeners, State Diagnostic Lab, those are all helpful online resources that might be able to get you a little bit deeper, make sure that you've correctly identified something. And then bugguide.net is a great online resource for insect identification. There's a community of people on there that provide photo ID of insects. Social media is also an option, but take the advice with a grain of salt, depending on where it's coming from. So in my case, I was able to identify my caterpillars that were in my echinacea through internet searches that matched the description of the damage and the image of the caterpillars that I'd found. So I had sunflower moth caterpillars feeding on the pollen and immature seeds of my purple coneflower. So once you know what you're dealing with, what steps you take to intervene kind of depend on your goals and what level of damage you're willing to tolerate. So if your goals are insect conservation, you might have a different level of damage you can tolerate as opposed to if you're growing food to eat or for profit. So in my own yard, my goals are conserving and supporting a diversity of insects and birds and other wildlife. Also to create kind of a beautiful space that I enjoy watching. And then also to use pretty much as little effort as possible. One of my goals is being lazy. So by keeping conservation front and center, it's easier for me to accept some chaos and some mess and to let go of some imperfections and nibbled leaves, knowing that insects and wildlife are using those plants that I've put out for them to use. And as long as those flowering resources are still generally available for pollinators and other wildlife. So based on those goals, I've made the decision in my own yard not to use pesticides. I want something that's healthy and functional with relatively minimal input and disturbance. Sometimes this means accepting some damage. Sometimes it means I have to accept that I haven't planted the right thing for my yard, or I can't support a particular plant in the space that I have. So if there's a plant that's struggling, I'm going to do my best to give it what it needs, but I can't grow everything that I want in my small little set of conditions in my yard. And that's okay. I'll find something that will. For folks like me that choose not to use pesticides, there are some non-chemical methods I can use instead or first after I know what I'm dealing with. So these were some leaf miners that showed up in my spinach in my garden. And after a couple rounds of just picking out infested leaves, that's what we might call sanitation, they were basically under control and the next set of leaves came up looking fine. So that's an easy option. For my purple coneflower, I generally let it go, but there have been some years where the sunflower moth caterpillars have gotten totally out of control and they're in every single flower head and there's no pollen left for bees and other butterflies and things that are coming to visit the echinacea. So in those years, sometimes I'll just clip off some of the infested flower heads, bag them up and take them away. And that's kept the outbreaks somewhat smaller for future years. Other insect outbreaks, hand picking and squishing or knocking them off with water are also good first steps to take if you're wanting to manage things without pesticides. I get a lot of oleander aphids on my milkweeds, those orange aphids. So for something like that, I can take a soft glove, dip it in water and just squish aphids off without even harming the plant stem. So there's some pretty easy cultural management methods you can use before turning to a pesticide. So most gardens can be managed well without pesticide inputs. When you have that foundation in place and can accept that lots of insects might be using your garden in ways you won't always like, your whole attitude can shift. But we recognize that that's not where everyone is. And you might have a prized plant that you can't imagine letting go of, like your grandmother's rose bush or your mom's raspberry canes. And it's being threatened by some kind of insect outbreak or disease. So if pesticides are part of your management system, we just want you to consider using them only when something is threatening the survival of and health of a plant, not for sort of cosmetic damage. Please seek out information on the toxicity of the product you're using to both people and pollinators. If you're not sure, if your yard is being managed by a land care company, please ask what they're using. We have resources available to help you gauge the toxicity of different pesticides to pollinators. We can help answer your questions about pesticide risk. So I have a slide at the end with some of those resources, but you can find them in all of our public publications database at xerces.org. Just search for pesticides. Okay, so that was my pesticide section. I hope it wasn't too doom and gloom. And I want to end on more of a positive note about building resilient, healthy ecosystems in yards and gardens. And just coming back to the idea that careful observation of your pollinators, careful observation of your plants can help you really improve over time in watching what blooms when and who visits it, what conditions they respond to in your yard, And then getting a little nosy with what's in your neighbor's yard, what grows well and buzzes with life in the yards around your neighborhood or around your community is a better indication of how well that plant is going to do in your own yard than how good it looks on the day that you go visit the nursery. So this is definitely a case where it's encouraged to be a nosy neighbor, and I've made several friends in my own neighborhood just by asking about their plants and what is it and where did you get it? So getting observant is a great way to improve your pollinator garden over time. So I'm so happy to present to a town that's thinking about connectivity. These pathway programs are so great for connecting green spaces and backyard habitats and for engaging neighbors and communities around building connected habitat for pollinators. This is a really exciting space for me as a pollinator conservation specialist. We're hoping to roll out similar programs across the country to try and get people really thinking about how they're contributing to a greater landscape scale connectivity for pollinators and other wildlife. It's really just amazing to see how much people engage with this kind of program and how great it can be for pollinators. By all of us taking these steps to put pollinator habitat into our yards, the base of the food chain and the base of our ecosystems is helping to be built out, and we're supporting all levels of plant communities and wildlife. So not just the small insects that are visiting our yards, but the birds and mammals that are feeding on the seeds and nuts that those plants are producing, and the pollinators themselves. Pollinator habitat has ripple effects that improve the functioning of our landscapes for all kinds of wildlife. So even though it feels like sometimes we're just doing something really small in our own yards, we're actually supporting the functioning of the ecosystems around us. So if you need other ideas for, you've built out your garden and you want to do more, I would encourage you to look at our resource library on our website and explore also some of the community science projects that are going on around your neighborhood, around regionally in the Northeast and around the country. So one I'll just point out that I mentioned at the very beginning, if you were already tuned in, is Bumblebee Watch, which is an opportunity to sort of observe and put your observations of bumblebees onto the Bumblebee Watch website. And that helps experts track different populations of bumblebees. It's helped in a couple instances to identify populations of rare or bumblebees. It also just kind of helps track populations over time and how they're distributed. So it's a great community science project. It's also great for you to learn how to identify bumblebees a little bit better. So you get out your smartphone, you take a picture, you go through these little identification keys for the bumblebee, and hopefully it'll get you to a place where you feel comfortable identifying some of your local bumblebees. So I'll just end here by, again, directing you to this library of resources that we have on all kinds of plant lists and habitat installation guides and monitoring protocols, lots of stuff. If there's anything that you're looking for and you can't find it, please reach out to us. You know, we're always trying to improve the kind of resources that we have available, and we really want to be answering your questions about pollinators and other beneficial insects. So I will just end it there and take questions.
Thank you, Emily. I see something coming up in the chat. Let's see what it is. It says colony collapse disorder is discussed with respect to honeybees. Does it also affect native bees species?
Good question. So colony collapse disorder is a phenomenon that is specific to honeybees. It's actually what got me into pollinators, was seeing all of the colony collapse disorder headlines back in 2006 or so when it started hitting the headlines. It's basically a very specific phenomenon in a honeybee hive where you have these disappearing worker bees. So the whole hive just kind of flies off and abandons its colony. So that's not something that you would see in native bees. It's a lot easier to track declines in honeybees than it is in native bees because they're just, these inconspicuous little bees living solitary lives around us. It's a lot easier to notice when you have 10,000 worker bees fly off in a night. It's a lot more disturbing, but we are expecting to see more and more monitoring data to come out showing declines in native bee species. And there's some big monitoring programs underway nationally to try and track that as well.
Another question is, are the publications you pushed up, are they available for purchase?
So all of our PDFs resources are available for free on our publications library. We have a couple of different books. Let's see. I think one of the ones I mentioned was Gardening for Butterflies. Oh, my virtual background is interfering. And then Attracting Native Pollinators. Those can be purchased wherever you get books. You can buy them through our gift store, but they come with a donation attached to them. So they're more expensive if you go through our gift and donation center than if you buy them from your regular bookstore.
Any other questions? Well, then I'm going to put up the end of my slideshow. Come on. Just to remind everybody, a pathway is not a single point, but a series of points that are close together. I'm hoping everybody is inspired this evening about our pollinator species and the special habitat needs they have, and that we want to help protect and preserve those things. And we all can have a part in that as we make our choices on how we, landscape our properties. And I encourage everybody to plant more natives, not to say rip out everything that's not native, but if you can incorporate more natives and incorporate multi-seasons of bloom, reduce your use of herbicides and pesticides, and reduce your lawn, which is basically not habitat for anything. Those are all things that we can do and make a better connectivity to all those great open spaces that we enjoy. So I would like y'all to take the pledge: rethink your lawn, plant natives, reduce fertilizers, avoid pesticides. And if you do that, your property can be on the pollinator pathway. And here's a couple of other citizen science. Emily and I were on the same page with the Bumblebee Watch. I did put the links to these particular citizen science activities that on the chat, so you can copy them before we close the program if you just open the chat. But Bumblebee Watch is one. Lost Ladybug Project is another one, where they're trying to get an idea of where native ladybugs are present. There's one, the 9-spotted ladybug, that's the lost one because they're just not as prevalent as they used to be. And there's another one called Firefly Watch that you can get involved with as well. These are great activities for the summer. When you're looking for things to do with your children who are so attached to their devices, well, these are activities you can take those cell phones outside and turn it into a learning experience. It's also good for your inner child. And goodness knows, I spend an awful lot of time staring at bushes just to look at the diversity of bees because I'm a nerd. I like that stuff. So that that ends our program for tonight. If there's any more questions, you can put them in the chat, or at this point, it's okay for you to unmute yourself if you just want to ask a quick question. Otherwise, we'll end the program and thank Emily for her presentation.
Thanks so much for having me.
As I said, I knew you'd give a great presentation because I've seen you do it before. All right, then. Thank you, Emily, and good night, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Remember, plant for those pollinators.